we'll be having two excellent guests from the University of Florence, Italy, telling us about using social habitus to understand everyday climate practices. So we are into climate change today, people. This is a very serious issue. And we have with us today Angela Perulli and Vincenzo Marasco, who will be reflecting on the climate change from the process sociological and civilizational perspective. Angela is Associate Professor of General Sociology, and she teaches general sociology, theories of social action, and gender and everyday life at the University of Florence. She is also the Deputy Coordinator of the PhD program in Social and Political Change at the University of Turin and Florence. And she is, of course, Chief Editor of Cambio, Journal of Social Change, so well known to many sociologists of the Eliasian persuasion, so to say. So Angela, great to have you with us finally. And we also have with us Vincenzo Marasco, who holds a PhD in historical and social sciences and is a research fellow at the Department of Political and Social Sciences at the University of Florence, and also a lecturer in sociology at the University of Milan. And Vincenzo is also involved as assistant editor with Cambio Journal on Social Change. And both of them today will tell us about how social habitus can be used to understand everyday climate practices based on their studies of Italian focus groups. So, as usual, we'll first have a presentation and then a round of Q&A. Thank you very much, Angela and Vincenzo, for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
So, Angela, I'm going first. First of all, thank you a lot, and we are really honored to be invited by the center. So, thank you, Marta and Marta, for all the work and the invitation. I'm sorry, but I'll rely on the written text for the as a support, because I fear that I lost myself in my own argument. So sorry, it's a bit more I don't know, slow and boring, let's say. So well, first of all, we are truly pleased that to take this opportunity to expand upon the reflection that Angela and I began during the wonderful conference in Dortmund, and this is basically the continuation of this kind of reasoning. And today we would like to discuss with you some ideas around the concept of social habitus as developed by Norbert Elias, exploring its relevance as a tool for analyzing what the literature refers as the demand side, the climate change mitigation demand side. So that is basically the impact of individual consumption practices on carbon emissions. So exactly, this slide outlined very briefly the structure, the very simple structure of our presentation. Oh, someone asked for the audio, but it's working. I mean, you can. Okay. So.
Sorry, I think it might be Paolo. Paolo, is your sound off? Or okay, now it's off. Thank you.
Okay. To begin with, well, before delving into the core of our argument, we believe that it could be useful to briefly present the context in which our argument originated, and well, the research project that is tied to it. So this will help probably to clarify from the outset both the scope and the limitation of our work, our reflections. So, secondly, we will highlight what we see as some key theoretical features of the concept of social habitus, features that, in our view, make it a more realistic tool than many others and an highly flexible one for exploring how climate-related anxiety and social pressures regarding individual behaviors are reflected in people actions. So, thirdly, we will try to support our claims using few excerpts from the focus group that are part of our research project. We want to make it clear here that these excerpts are presented as what we can see for illustrative purpose only. No, they do not represent definitive research findings, as the project is still ongoing actually. So what we are interested in for the purpose of today's discussions is to suggest some possible way of interpreting individuals' behaviors through the lens of habitus. Okay, so actually, today's reflection stems from the convergences from two research lines. The first one concerns a study that Angela and I were conducting on the role and characteristic of the concept of habitus in Elias' works. The starting point was that although habitus is one of the central concepts in Elias' thought, and one of the most frequently used by scholars, and you know very well that its use within Elias' own writing remains relatively underdeveloped. So we started inquiring that line. No? This was primarily, of course, a textual study of Elias' works, based on the hypothesis that the properties of the concept of social habitus evolved over time, or to say it more precisely, that the concept is progressively redefined and expanded as the object of the Elias inquiry shift and diversify throughout his career. So there is also a second line of research that is a research project that involves both of us, focused on low carbon behaviors. Its name is Pro-Social Climate, was launched last year and is still ongoing, as I said, and the project brings together the University of Florence, Pavia, and Naples, and explore low carbon orientation and practices in Italy. As you can see in the slide, the project includes several research phases, including a survey and a survey experiment, and all are currently underway. Today, as we already told you, we will concentrate on the part that has already been completed, that is the 12 focus group. The project main objective is to identify social mechanisms that might support the adoption of low carbon behavior and practices in Italy. To put it very generally, the research could be stated like as follows. In Italy, as in other high-income country, the issue of carbon emission tied to individual and domestic consumption can be summarized like that. We all know in what direction we should be changing our behavior in our everyday lifestyles, but we don't actually do it. And the literature on climate change and individual behavior identifies a number of potential mechanisms that could support such change. Our goal is to contribute to this discussion by exploring how, our goal today, exploring how habitus might help to better understand these dynamics. Okay, I already get lost on my own slide. So, well, the starting point could be that the starting point of our project is that literature on climate science mitigation, demand-side climate mitigation, is largely built on two assumptions. And these are that they use mostly individualizing lens and a pro-environmental paradigm. Let me explain this a little bit. That the first one means that basically they try to explain, of course, the literature on demand-side climate mitigation is enormous, and of course there's a lot of varieties, but mostly they try to understand behaviors as the result, the effects of a individual rational decision or individual decisional process. So, for example, focusing on what have an impact of the cognitive process that could lead to a change in behavior. With a pro-environmental paradigm, what we meant was that basically the assumption is that what is missing is a more pro-environmental attitude, that shape, that behavior. So that difference in individuals' carbon emissions are mainly driven by the strength or the weakness of their pro-environmental attitude. So if the issue is posed this way, basically you have only two types of explanation possible. Either a cognitive one, where the actor does not behave in a pro-environmental way because they for example, they are unaware of the problem, or they are aware but they don't know what to do. Or a cost-based explanation, where the actor is well informed but in a way lacks a sufficiently strong environmental motivation to overcome this cost associated with a lifestyle change, for example. Now, the core of our project, the core focus of our project, we won't delve into it in detail today, but is to explore whether and to what extent carbon emission reduction can instead be driven by pro-social form of action. So that is, for example, new forms of solidarity, etc., etc. Anyway, as you may have already gathered from what I told, this is not a project that originated under the influence of processual sociology, nor does it in itself assign a central role to the concept of habitus, of course. So the fact is that since Angela and myself were already working on the previous line of research mentioned before, Habitus immediately appeared to us as a promising analytical lens and one worth testing to further investigate the very set of questions that the project begins with, namely the limitation of this kind of interpretative frameworks that I talked before. So the question we pose is basically what advantages does the concept of habitus offer as an analytical tool that allows us to go beyond both the individualistic lens and the narrowly environmental paradigm that I have just described. As mentioned earlier, we will attempt to answer this question first by unpacking certain theoretical aspects and then illustrating them with examples drawn from the focus group conducted so far. Precisely because of how the research process unfolded, what we are proposing is not an Eliasian reading of climate change centered on habitus, but rather an attempt to highlight how the notion of habitus emerged within the perspective shared by participants in this focus group. So let's start with the habitus finally. Okay. To begin with, it's important to acknowledge that actually Elias does not offer, as often is the case, a clear-cut definition of habitus. His use of the term is often summarized by the expression second nature. I translate it like a set of durable, socially acquired dispositions that are so deeply internalized that they are perceived as natural, innate, and operate in an automatic and blind fashion. In this sense, this definition is pretty minimal, but however, the conceptual core captured by this definition plays a central role in the overall structure of Elias' theoretical system. It expresses in a condensed form, as the slide says, the link, the hinge between sociogenetic and psychogenetic processes. That is, it reflects how change in pattern of social interdependence and are intertwined with change in the psychological structure of human beings, so their psychological makeups. So look at it in this way, I want to highlight two key theoretical functions that are exactly the how it allows to move beyond the actor system dichotomy by showing that individualization and social conditioning are not opposing force but two interrelated aspects of the same of people's mutual relations, no? So for example, there are not abstract goals that must be transmitted to individual in this way. No, you don't need abstract goal that must be transmitted to individuals by the system. No, rather, individual social personalities emerge directly from the reciprocal functional interdependencies. Second, and it's very important for us today, it helps us to move beyond the rationality emotional dichotomy. So, habitus manifests itself in behaviors and sensibilities that are typical of a particular configuration that generates specific forms of rationality. A clear example of that, for example, is the official rationalität of the cultural rationality, no, analyzed in the cultural society. And so emotional and cognitive dimension are not treated as opposites, but are instead integrated into a long-term process of rationalization that can lead to diverse outcomes. So this is the first point believe we need to emphasize. The next slide. Of course, Angela, if I'm going, I have no control of time, of course. So make me some signs necessary, Angela, please. So the next is, no, this is the right slide, sorry. Uh, there is a second point that for us is very important to okay, we won't be able to dwell on it for long, but we think it's theoretically important, no? While the expression second nature essentially refers to something that operates mostly blindly, I would say that notion of habitus actually includes elements that, so to speak, they see very clearly. That's what I mean is that habitus is shaped not only by reflective embodied dispositions, but also by elements that individual access some way reflexively, no, through not necessarily rationally. For example, habitus are constituted by also institutionalized practice, means of orientation, etc., through which people navigate the world. So, among these elements, for instance, there are processes of identification. This means that an individual personality structure, not the individual psychological makeup, and so the mechanism of self-control and behavioral regulation develop also through self-image and self-ideal, no, formed by identifying with the identity of the group they belong, and so with a we image, and in contrast, for example, to the identity of groups they distinguish themselves from, so the them image. This point is important because it helps us to understand emotional expressions linked to habitus, not only as internalization of fear and threats, which may, for example, show up as a shift in the threshold of repugnance, but also as emotionally charged fantasies, defensive attitudes, or aggressive, for example, in response to perceived threat to internalized image, for example. So the third point that we want to make is that, can you move on, Angela, please? Okay. But according to what we are coming to say, the third point is that habitus should not be understood simply as, I don't know, habitual behavior or disposition in a general manner, in a general sense, but as something root in structural, emotional, and affective regulation. This habitus, shaped through a historical process and then embodied, gives rise to a specific emotional regime, one that functions both as a driver of action and as a constraint. So, as we have mentioned, emphasizing the role of emotion in consumption practice does not mean, of course, interpreting them as emotional actions, in contrast to rational ones. On the contrary, what we wanted to stress is that within habitual practice, these emotions, this emotional, say, layer is like constitute the underlying logic of the everyday life. So, in the narrative, we will see emotional expression help construct actually the worldviews of participants. No? They are rooted in biographical experience and subjective preferences, but they emerge in discourses as a way of making sense of one's being in the world, of their position in the world. So, this emotional regime shape, in a way, it shape a normative horizon, one that is of course not grounded in rational consideration, but in it's shaped by emotionally charged interdependencies, and it conveys fears related to status, survival, group rights. So we are making the point that these in habitus emotions emerge, as the actually the result of these emotionally charged interdependencies. So emotions are not just outcomes of social tension and conflict, but they also, in a way, they are habitus allows to watch to emotions as something created by social reality, but at the same time they also create society. They reinforcing or reinforce or weakens the social bonds. In fact, these emotional regimes take on some of the function that in other sociological tradition can be associated with the concept of common sense, no? But unlike common sense, its concern is not only representations of the world. It's not that is not something that works in a cognitive framework mostly, but also one ways of feeling. So this is our third point, no? An emotional regime that is also a way to make sense of the world. Finally, our last point is that this emotional regime of conduct which constitute an habitus, take shape through specific form of external control and self-control. Habitus shows not only captures the social nature of emotional life, but does something more. That is, it links these emotional regimes to the dynamics of control as conceptualized as concept. Sorry, I have something that continue to pop up. Has conceptualized in Elias triad of controls. So this means that emotional dimension and emotional regimes are not arbitrary cultural constructs, rather they are shaped by and could be analyzed by the study of the power that human beings exercise over the environment or nature, and the power relationship between individuals and structured by figurational arrangement and institutionalized practices, and the form of self-restraint required from individuals. So I will only touch on this briefly because it goes really beyond what we can address here through our focus group. But climate change can be interpreted in these terms as the transformation in the control of in the control that human beings exercise over the environment. And this transformation may have a paradoxical outcome in the sense that an increase of interdependencies, which on the one hand amplifies the effect of human action on the health of the planet, and on the other hand is not matched by any collective control over the goals of the action. So at the same time, this transformation with the fears and threat it triggers, is also reflected in the power relationship between groups. There are, of course, groups that disproportionately suffer the direct effect of the climate crisis. But here, what we want to stress is that there are also groups that feel threatened in different ways, not by the effect of the crisis itself, but by the potential shift in practices and norms that greater environmental reflexivity would require. So, in short, this new, can say, new economy of fear and threat, whether grounded in reality or fantasy, also shapes different forms of self-control and emotional regulation. Okay, you can go on. So, of course, again, I lost my discourse, but that's not important. We are just at the first conclusion of this part. That is trying to answer the basically the our first question. In relationship with what we said about the literature, the principal literature of the on the demand side climate mitigation, we can see that Habitus actually overcome the first problem, no, of an individualizing lens that can interpret behavior just as the result of an individual decisional process. In that, Habitus, as we have seen, is both individual and collective. And it allows to move beyond a purely cognitive reading of practices, because, as you may know, in this mostly psychological literature, all the, you can say that all the part of non-cognitive processes is like they are treated like an external force that enter in the decisional process. So actually, they are always something external. The paradoxical case is that habits itself are interpreted as something that happen on the behavior and not the behavior itself, actually, how habit is actually. So in this way, we can turn the table around, and at the same time, it can allows us to keep together what is stable, natural, and emerging from a long history, but also it is remain open to change. So in this way, it's able to also allow us to not just to explain, for example, where we are blocked in some behavior, but also to try to figure out why some specific practice evolves, for example. And if I may say the last thing, and then I will quit. For example, in relationship to other approaches that are very useful, like, for example, social practices approach, they're very, very widely used in this kind of literature. You have the advantage that the social practice is not something closed in itself. Through the habitus lens, is something that is linked to the say figurational structure and dynamics. So we can start with the empirical part. So Angela, it's you go. No, you are mute.
Yes, Angela, you're muted.
Yes. Thank you, Vincenzo. How many time we have left now?
I'd say like 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Just to so thank you. And now we will turn to the transcription from our focus group, as Vincenzo already said. We try to show how we could answer some question referring to the original hypothesis of climate change research project we mentioned before. The first question could be, why is it that even though people know that current patterns of behavior are no longer sustainable, they do not adopt new and different ones? If we go to some quote of our focus group, the first one you can see in the slide. People say about habits that are deeply rooted as we get older, the more time passes, the more those habits become entrenched in us. Questioning them, stepping outside of them, making radical changes, even to small everyday habits, becomes harder. These are things we do automatically. We don't really reflect on them anymore because for us they feel natural. I'm not saying they feel right, but they feel natural. They seem normal in our eyes. Even if they are dysfunctional, they become something we no longer really think about because they come to us so instinctively. The first point we could and we would like to highlight here is that there is a sort of reassuring function of the habitus. This excerpt illustrates, first and foremost, the habitual nature of energy consumption choice, but it does so in a way that clearly links the habits to a kind of common sense, insofar as they blur the distinction between what is normal and what is right, as the first speaker seems to let slip. It reveals a world that, through its sense of security and routine logic, acquires normative and identificatory value, a dynamic we'll see again in the following excerpt. Here we aim to draw attention to the reassuring emotional function embedded in the habitus. Let's say the other excerpt. Anyway, I found my balance with my diet. I've adjusted it a bit to reach a certain equilibrium. Right now, I'm not changing it. I'm just not willing to at the moment. Also, because this whole topic often comes with the idea of the new diet, like insects replacing meat. Everyone's gone crazy over this cricket floor. And that, in a way, kind of acts as a deterrent because you feel like you have to deal with something that just doesn't belong to you. So it kind of puts you off. I've thought about cutting down on meat, but then you'd go, if that's the alternative we have. Here we have a particularly rich excerpt, one that incidentally seems like a striking illustration of a familiar cultural trope, the traditional relation between Italian and food. Let's say another one. It shows habitus as a form of emotional charge group belonging, a sense of identity grounded in shared affective attachments. There are at least 3 analytical levels we would like to point out, but first a few contextual details. This exchange took place in central Italy in a group of young people, mostly university students. The speaker is a young woman from the
Angela,
south.
sorry, is the wrong slide.
Sorry.
This is the slide. You are reading the comment to the slide of the young lady who eat real meat.
I'm sorry. I can't see.
Is the 2, I think.
That is.
Sorry, my fault in the composition of the slide, probably. Sorry.
So, yes, that is. Sorry about that. There are at least 3 analytical levels we would like to point out. I say that this young lady came from the south of Italy. That is a significant detail, as the emotions associated with the food practices here function as a way to differentiate herself from the others and reaffirm her own cultural belonging. She talks about coming from the South, where real meat is eaten, and defends the legitimacy of her practices, eventually launching into a kind of invecting against new ways of eating. First, in her description of real meat, she is signaling more than a just preference or opinion. She is expressing an horizon of meaning in which she lives, with which she identifies, and which she regards as normatively correct. This horizon is strongly tied to her self-ideals and rooted in a perceived need to defend a threatened world. Second, her account strongly reaffirms what we might call her positioning in the figurational flux. It does so in clear opposition to other identities that emerge in the discussion, in which the we-they dynamic becomes quite explicit. Third, her argument activates an emotional register that entirely transcends rational reasoning. From a purely argumentative standpoint, her reasoning is inconsistent. She mixes vegetarianism, the loss of traditional culinary culture, and the new health-driven eating norms, all as if they were part of the same phenomenon. But in her emotional experience, they are. They all produce the same affective reaction. From a social logic perspective, though, her emotional reasoning is entirely coherent. She correctly identifies the underlying process, the disappearance of traditional food culture, and see it as the terrain on which new motivations are emerging, including climate-related ones. But for her, the specific motivation don't matter. What she clearly perceives is the symbolic threat to her group identity. It's also worth noting that this type of exchange does not reveal an acquisite passion that the speaker refuses to give up due to cost. On the contrary, she laments precisely the loss of a cultural standard of civility, made of meal structure, balance, and strict rules, and sees in its place a decline into informality and individual idiosyncrasies, such as avoiding palm oil. What this dialogue enacts, in short, a conflict between habitus, a struggle between different horizons of meaning, in which the regulation of conduct is embedded in the clash between conflicting self-images and self-ideals. Sorry. When then have a second group of cases there where habitus emerges primarily as an inhibiting factor in relation to a given behavior. Here, habitus appear a way in which, a way with which rational connection meets emotional rigidity. Here, for example, we face with the classical dilemma highlighted in the literature on why it is difficult to adopt low-carbon solutions. We encounter individuals who do not question the idea that doing more would be the right thing to do. But, as the first speaker in this expert makes clear, what is at stake is the exhausting adjustment of one's self-control, which is currently judged as already sufficient. At this point, emotion is introduced as a means to justify the morality of this position. It's not that doing more would be unreasonable in itself, but rather that it's blocked by the emotional distance from one's own habits. This emotional distance became an expression of something that feels unfeasible, of a change in one's relation with the world that cannot even be contemplated, something experienced as inherently unreasonable. This is what, during the Dortmund presentation, we described as emotional barrier, a mechanism that frees the situation through the feeling that any further change will be something utterly foreign, alien to the self. The second question we can pose and we can try to answer through our focus group is how is it that even though we know we should change, we still manage to justify persisting practices we know to be harmful? We also have example in our focus group where people do not only acknowledge the problem, but also express a willingness to change, and yet something still makes change difficult. In an Eliasian framework, the invitation to reflect on how one's actions may impact the environment, particularly for future generations, points to long-term trends toward great foresight and an increasing awareness of interdependencies, both among human beings and between humans and the environment. This implies an horizon in which individuals are asked to become aware of ecological chains and cycles, and to reflect on the long-term consequence of present actions in face of long-term uncertainty. In this context, habitus may emerge in the tension between the demand for greater self-restraint and the perceived lack of any control over external effects. From this perspective, the problem of the commons is not framed as a classical free rider issue, but rather as an inability of a group to establish a shared horizon within which new forms of consumption or lifestyles change can be grounded. Habitus manifests here in the form of specific reactions to the problem. The first is the displacement of responsibility onto others, other groups, other categories. The most common target is China, as seen in the first quote. Regarding China, some of the most exaggerated ideas emerge, often framing it as a place of radical otherness. In the second case, the issue is more generational, a theme that came up frequently in our focus groups with the younger participants. What clearly emerged here is the individual cost of changing behavior, which is perceived as unreasonable to bear. And this is justified by the idea that somewhere in the world, someone else is rowing in the opposite direction. But rather than ask what might lead individuals to personally bear those costs, a reading through the lens of habitus invites us to consider what kind of figurational structure make it possible for responsibility not to be assumed as a part of group's identity. In the case, habitus appears as a source of justification, veiled beneath a logic that seems rational, even game theoretical on the surface. There is a sort of moral right to preserve one's habits based on the idea that sacrifice only makes sense if others are doing it too. And the sacrifice lies precisely in having to abandon one's established routines and practices. The second type of reaction is still linked to the feeling of isolation in the face of demands to change one's conduct. But instead of shifting responsibility onto others, it turns into a call for stronger external controls. What emerges is the sense that there are no institutional mechanisms capable of taking on the collective dimension of these challenges, no structures in place that can foster an institutional environment favorable to the development of new collective horizons of meaning, and thus a new habitus. People are left feeling as though they are alone in face of the unreasonable demands for change. And they find themselves unable to build any strong political demand around the issue, no shared framework that could turn individual concern into coherent political practices. What remains then is the appeal for more external regulation, fines, bans, restrictions, a response that implicitly expresses a need for control, but one that emerges in the absence of a social and politically organized demand. In this sense, the call for enforcement substitutes for the lack of institutional support and collective meaning making. As we have argued throughout, habitus is not a fixed layer with a solely reproduction function in relation to social order. Habitus evolves, making new forms of self-conduct appear normal. The meaning of practices can shift, and so can the horizon of meaning to which they are anchored. Here we see a clear example of what we have called an emotional barrier, so deeply internationalized that the first case, the very sight of meat, triggered disgust. In the second, it manifests a physical block, one that, according to the speaker's own words, overrides conscious willpower. This is a case where emotions allow us to observe the formation of a new habitus, a moment in which change becomes visible. Two short reflections of this exchange. First, what we observe here could be described as a form of conspicuous disgust, that is, a visible expression of disgust used to mark one's position and assert moral or symbolic distinction. Second, the formation of this new habitus is not evenly distributed across the social fabric. From our interviews, these shifts appear to be strongly gendered, more common among younger generations, at least in relation to food, especially visible in the urban settings, where the rural tradition has been largely eroded over several generations, and where the relationship with the natural world has been replaced by relationships with other people. From an Eliasian perspective, this can be read as a signal of a civilization process, a move away from the implicit violence involved in killing living beings. In this light, what we are seeing in the internalization of a new emotional regime. The cultural device that once braked that violence, while simultaneously turning meat into a symbol of both abundance and festive sacrifice, no longer functions effectively. In fact, its symbolic values has declined to the point that the violence implied by the presence of meat has become intolerable. That said, it's worth nothing that, once again, climate-related motivations seem to play a merely ancillary role in this transformation. It is not environmental awareness or knowledge per se that drives this process, but rather a broader civilizing shift in relation to food, which may draw upon different and even competing types of knowledge. This raises important questions. What social processes underpin this new sensibility, and how this emerging emotional regime culturally shaped or occupied by conflicting discourses, such as those related to health versus climate?
Angela, si può passare solo a quella delle conclusioni e saltiamo l'ultima.
And so we come to our conclusion. Clearly, any analysis that aims to seriously address carbon emissions from the perspective of habitus would need to engage more fully with the historical evolution of practices and sensibilities, not as isolated phenomena, but as a part of the broader transformation in the structure of interdependencies. That said, we believe that this reconstruction has been sufficient to show how an habitus-based reading can help shed light on some of the blind spots left by literature on demand-side mitigation. Certainly, issues such as information, the promotion of pro-environmental values, and the reduction of the costs associated with low carbon behavior are central to the discussion. However, on their own, they do not fully explain the persistence of behaviors and practices that are not only dysfunctional in the long term, but often perceived as such even by those who engage in them. Without taking into account the emotional dimension embedded in the reproduction of social practices, that is, in habitus, it is difficult to make sense of this persistence. Secondly, we have tried to show that the logic driving these practices is often not an individual logic, but a social one, shaped by power relations, status differences, group competition, and emotional reaction to perceived threats against long-standing ways of doing and feeling, rooted in both personal and collective histories. Thank you.